I'm Sean Hannon. I appreciate the invitation and Marks and Darren for bringing me in and organizing this. I just have about 15 short minutes with you to share some thoughts, so I'll do that and then hopefully generate some conversation. You can see up here on the slide, I titling this "Practical Lessons Learned from Leading at the Point of the Spear." And the reason that I say this is I'm going to share with you a little bit about my thinking about leading in extreme context, not just from a scholarly perspective, but also as a practitioner for many years in the field. Darren already gave you an overview of my bio, but I did spend close to 3 decades in the United States Army. I fought in a total of 9 different combat and contingency operations around the globe. Some of the key ones are up here. The Cold War, of course, back with East and West Germany for quite some time doing cross-border operations there. Fought with the lead attack element in Operation Desert Storm, the Los Angeles riots back in 1992, the Cuban boat lift crisis in Panama and then Cuba in 1994. And as Darren said, I was serving in the Pentagon on 9/11, and I'll actually share a short story about that with you here in a few minutes. I transitioned after being an operator for many years to become a West Point professor. So the Army sent me off to get my PhD in leadership development at the University of Nebraska, and then come back to West Point, where I was the director of leadership and management programs. And I later stood up a Army-wide center called the Center for the Army Profession and Ethics, which was responsible for studying what is it to be a profession across the entire active and reserve Army, and be a profession in a dangerous profession, and what are the tenets of the profession and the values and beliefs and ethos of the profession, that type of thing. So I retired from the Army in 2012 and went down to Wake Forest School of Business. So I've lived the life of being an extreme operator, and then been studying it now for since about 2003. When I started my PhD in 2002, and it was a pretty natural flow for me to choose this as one of my top areas of emphasis, obviously because of my personal interests in advancing scholarship and theory and research around this area. It really hadn't been very well studied at that time. So Darren mentioned our 2009 article. I was mentioning before you all came on, I wish we could go back and rewrite it, right? With hindsight, you learn more, but at the time, this was our key thinking. And one of the things we found, there really wasn't definitions of extreme in the literature between extreme events and extreme context. So this is lifted right out of the article. There had been definitions out there like Christine's on crisis and things like that, but not necessarily an extreme context or event. Crises by definition are typically extreme context and or events, but not all extreme contexts or events are crises. I can, just speak even from personal experience, flying in on a helicopter to conduct a raid. Many people would look at that as, an extreme event, but if I'm with a highly trained group of airborne rangers and we're going in to take down an objective and get back out again, it feels a little bit more like a day at the office than it does an extreme event. And it's because of the attenuators that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes that organizations can build. But I do think it's important to differentiate an extreme event from an extreme context. So you can take like the US Army recent deployments to Afghanistan or to Iraq, for example. That is an extreme context because it's an environment where extreme events might or might not happen. And there's enough of a probability that they might occur that we obviously have to prepare, think about, and get the team ready to face those possible magnitudes of consequences. But that's very different than in situ actually being in an extreme event. When soldiers are back at base camp, they're watching TV, they're playing video games, they're calling home. Sure, they're deployed to an operational combat theater. Or I work a lot with fire departments, and you see the guys and gals, at the firehouse, jaw-jacking, having fun. But as soon as that bell rings and they got to get in the fire trucks and head out, it's a different story. And so I think it's really important as we study this that we look at both of these and understand that there might be even a sequence of extreme events occurring in an extreme context. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to emphasize. Now, you've seen this chart, which is out of the 2009 article. And it was, again, our attempt to create a typology to begin to understand what is an extreme context and event, and think about some of the parameters we might want to study within it. Some of the logic down below, like I said, extreme contexts are not necessarily crises. Crises occur in my definition. Christine might have different, but in my definition, a crisis is where things have gone off the rail to a point where we necessarily can't control it. It might be exceeding our organizational resources or our planning or our preparation or even our psychological capabilities. And so people feel in a certain sense of disarray in that kind of an environment. Whereas in extreme environment, again, it might certainly be a crisis, particularly if we don't have enough of those attenuators in place to limit the amount of extremity that we experience in that context. But we're not necessarily, again, in a crisis situation if we're well trained, well resourced, and prepared for the event. And that's just that second bolt there, that what is extreme is very relative. You talk like to Medal of Honor winners, for example, and they all talk about, hey, I was just doing what I was trained to do. I'm nothing special. Thank you for this award, but I was trained to do this, and this is what we're expected to do. And our values and beliefs are that we go above and beyond when necessary to put ourselves at personal risk for the team. It's more of a day in the office kind of thing. I don't want to downplay it at all. It's not my intent, but I think we really need to understand that what is extreme is extremely relative. And I don't think there's enough research understanding that. And what are those factors that prepare organizations to operate in the extreme, where it is more of a normal environment for them, even though others will look at that environment as a, very, very extreme. I also think we need to spend a lot more time looking at what are those attenuators that we need to build. How do we do that? How do we prepare a team to go into these type of environments? And also the ethical implications. I cannot think of an extreme event that does not have extreme ethical challenges that we need to prepare operators to go in and deal with, and to be able to effectively operate in an environment where they can make quick decisions as need be under values and beliefs and ideals of the organization to maintain that ethos. So on the left, there are some of the things that we identified as core elements of a typology of extreme events or extreme context. Again, it could be one or the other, but there's this idea of the location and time. Are we in preparation for extreme events? Are we in situ of extreme events, or is it post? Are we in a recovery phase? How each one of those will affect the team and the type of leadership that is needed is quite different. Or if you're in an environment where there's a lot of repetition of extreme events. I can remember some times in my career where we fly back in on a helicopter and have 30 minutes to refit and rearm, and we're airborne again and go out on the next mission. And when you get into a repetition or a cycle, similar to like a fire department, here in Charlotte, nearby where I live, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the average firehouse rolls out 11 times a day. Now, some of those might be a cat stuck in a tree, but some of those are a fire. Some of those are, dangerous situations with probability and magnitudes of consequences. And so we have to think about that location of time. Not only is it before, during, or after an extreme event, but also this idea of oscillating back and forth. Magnitude of consequences is pretty self-explanatory, but also what are the probability of those consequences is happening? Is it a higher or low probability? And that's going to have a lot of effect on the team and how it prepares and reacts to these events. And then how proximal is it to you? Physical proximity. Am I physically in danger? Either, physical harm or my mental well-being. Am I personally going to be impacted or not? But also psychosocial. How close do I feel to the people that are in harm's way or that are experiencing that extreme event? You hear all the time about, operators, whether they be fire, police, or military, talking about, those folks back at headquarters, right? They just don't get us. They don't know what's going on here. there's a potential disconnect between, boots on the ground at the point of the spear and like more headquarters. But, you get to lower levels, and like when I was a company commander, let's say, or a battalion commander, even though I was maybe in my command post and my soldiers were out on the field, I still felt an extreme level of social proximity to them. And so depending on how generally invested you are, whether you're personally at risk or feel very close to those that are, will influence the amount of extremity that you experience. And then, of course, what's the form of the threat? Is it psychological, threat to my psychological well-being, physical harm? Is it financial or facilities, or what is the danger that might happen? So we can look at these different types of situations based off these 5 different areas of typology. But then based on what that mix is in a particular situation, then the question is, what kind of attenuators have we built in the organization to go through and experience that event, but still not feel an extremely high level of extremity? Going back again to that Ranger team going in or whatever, have we built the psychological resources like courage and resilience and psychological capital? Have we built the social resources like collective efficacy or cohesion or support networks that we can rely on each other? Organizational resources, have we built the technical, financial, and human resources to face these types of events? Have we properly trained? Do we have effective plans and contingency plans in place? Do we have organizational adaptability where we built ahead of time that we can shift our methods and our processes and our systems very rapidly to meet the situational demands? If so, all those will attenuate the experience of extremity. But there's also a lot of intensifiers that could happen. And, these items in these boxes are not meant to be all inclusive, but a couple of those are time and complexity. Are we under time compression where we don't have a lot of time to make decisions? Or duration? If it's a long, ongoing type of extreme situation, it can really wear people down. Or again, that idea of cycling in and out, the frequency of events can cause a lot of intensity also, because people don't have time to properly refit, reorganize, and to go through, the meaning making that you might want to after an extreme event before you get thrown right back into another one. Complexity also has a lot to do with just the complexity of the situation. I mean, is it something where we can quickly define the problem or quickly define the solution to the problem, or is it of the level of complexity that we can't? And so we are now in more of what I would call more of a crisis mode, because we're trying to figure out what's going on and having to react in a very less planned and organized type of manner. So all those factors will influence the perceived level of extremity. But then you see also these moderators, we show them going out after the level of extremity box, which means even though it's going to influence how much we feel and experience the level of extremity, it also, though, will moderate our response to them. So even though we may feel a high level of extremity, we still can then rely on those psychological resources, those social resources, those organizational resources, everything else to hopefully create a more of an adaptive leadership response. And however we respond then is going to influence our attenuators and our intensifiers, so those feedback loops. Does the adaptive response build further resources in the team, for example? And if so, then it'll build those resources over time. So this was our general thinking about trying to create a general typology. This article was not intended to create the solution, right? It doesn't list what are the adaptive leadership responses. It's more of a typology article. We've published other articles in Academy Management Journal and JAP and some others where we've done research like in combat with soldiers actually in combat theater, where we've tried to tease out some of these ideas about what are adaptive responses. So I picked this one to talk about 9/11 just because it's quite timely with the 20th year anniversary here 2 years ago. But as I mentioned, on 9/11, I was working the Pentagon. My office was right over where this laser beam is here, off to the side of the blast zone, one ring in. And everybody in my office got out okay. We didn't even know what happened. You know, you talk about an ambiguous situation. We just knew there was an explosion. We hadn't yet even identified what happened, where did it happen in this huge building that has 25,000 people in it. So we all evacuated out the back fire escapes, but I got a call to come in and take over for David Lachek, who was killed in the attack. And David was the director of Resource Services Washington, which was an organization that was at the headquarters of the Army, responsible for a $32 billion budget. So a huge budget operation. As it shows in the center, they had lost 84% of their people killed in the attack. The picture that you see in the middle is their office. So as you can see, there was just nothing left. Everything was destroyed. And this was not an organization of soldiers. These were Department of the Army civilians that were accountants and financial managers that were responsible for this budget. And so this was an event that's after the extreme event, right? The attack had already happened. Now we're in the the recovery phase and figuring out what's next, and preparation for possible other attacks that might happen past this. It's September 11th, so we had 19 days to reconstruct a $32 billion budget before the fiscal year closes out for the United States Army at the end of the fiscal year. So I walked in this office, I had no idea what to expect. I had stayed up all night the night before, just filling out paperwork with all the stuff that I thought we had to do to prepare this organization to stand back up after this attack and move forward. And I really, to be honest with you, didn't even know if everybody's going to show back up to work. These were not soldiers. They were not required to come to work. They could quit anytime they want. They were civilians. But when I walked in that next morning, every single person was there. Every single employee came right back to work the very next day. That's where they decided that's where they needed to be. And not only did they show up, but they showed up with a huge amount of commitment to getting this job done. Meanwhile, that same day, people are flying in from all over the United States. People are flying in from Europe and around the world that used to work in this organization and just wanted to show back up to help the team stand back up and get going again. And I walked into this room and saw these faces all looking at me, kind of just wondering, you know, what are we going to do at this point forward? And I was so thankful because something caught my attention. I put down all my paperwork and I just asked a simple question. I said, what do you need from me? And they all just started listing off the things that they wanted from me as a leader. So going back to that last slide about an adaptive response, sometimes it's not best a leader standing there and saying, this is what the response ought to be. Sometimes it's better to ask your team, what do you need from me? And they started listing off everything that they wanted from me. And only about maybe 20% of what was on my list that I filled out the night before did they even mention. Big lesson learned in times of crisis. Our job is to give the team that which they cannot give themselves as a leader. You know, if you think about that, right? If they've already know what to do, they've already got the resources, are already motivated, whatever it is, they don't need those responses from you. They need those things that they cannot give to themselves. And so they started listing off, they wanted me largely to be an external leader, keep the press off their back, bring in resources, recreate the processes and systems and the equipment and everything else. They were like, boss, we got the ball on how to rebuild the budget. You just need to give us the context so that we can make that happen. So a lot of getting ready for extreme events is that preparation. And I put over here the Army values. I put over here the warrior's ethos in the United States Army. These were things that David Lachek had trained in this team. He spent a lot of time talking to them about values and the ethos and the purpose of what they do. And that was what drove them back to work, was all that preparation. Again, going back to those attenuators, those strengths that the team can bring together to face this kind of a crisis. You know, loyalty, words like that. A lot of them said, I came back from my peers. I knew that they were going to be there. A lot of them felt a lot of duty toward the mission. Probably don't have much time here, but let me give you a quick story, because one time I was down there, I was a customer of this organization. So some of them knew me. They handled my budget. I was walking with David Lachek back to his office one day, and this lady jumped up out of her chair and really got in his face. And she just got off the phone with an angry customer. And she just said, all right, I'm done with this. I want a job transfer. I don't do anything important around here. I'm tired of my job. And her job was to process postage bills for the Army. And that's all she did all day long, process postage bills, put them in the accounting software, filing them away, rinse and repeat every single day. But, David stopped her, and these were his exact words to her. He said, you don't process postage bills. You send mail to soldiers. You send equipment around the world where it needs to be so the Army can do its mission. And her eyes just lit up and she sat down, right? He had built in her a sense of purpose. What does she do? Why is it important? How does it fit into the bigger picture? It's things like that that bring people back to work. It's things like that that give the commitment to the organization, the commitment to the mission, those social and psychological factors that I mentioned that are needed in order to be successful. So you think about this typology, location and time, we were post-event. So my focus as a leader had to be on how do we recover from this. I had also prepared for what if we get hit again? At that time, we had no idea if these attacks would continue. So we're trying to rebuild the organization at the same time we're thinking about preparing for possible next attacks. The magnitude of consequences here was obviously huge with 84% loss of everyone. The probability is 100% because it just happened with, whatever percentage possibility of it happen again. These people felt extreme proximity. Every single person that they worked with that was in the office that day got killed. There was no survivors on site that day. Everybody was on meeting to the other side of the Pentagon or whatever. And this was, a physical danger threat. So you think about that typology, and I've already mentioned some of the attenuators that brought this team together. They had good contingency plans for loss of operations. They had built those psychological and social resources in the team, that sense of purpose, that commitment, the cohesion for the team. Intensifiers, though, we were under extreme pressure with 19 days to reconstruct this huge $32 billion budget and a lot of complexity because we didn't know how to do it. We had to reconstruct paperwork from across the entire United States Army because we lost everything we had on site. But some of the key lessons learned there, again, as far as an adaptive leadership response, were number one, find out what does your team need from you. Think about how to provide that. Make sure that you think hard about how do I want to show up as a leader? How do I want to set the tone for this organization to pull it forward? But I think the biggest lesson to learn always is it's in the preparation. And that's something we do all the time in the Army. We're always preparing and training for realistic situations that might happen. So with that, this up here is a slide that kind of shows my research. A lot of the stuff that's on the far left are things that have all been driven largely by my experiences in extreme contexts and things that I think are absolutely critical in those contexts, building the character of individuals and teams, building that moral complexity where you can handle tough right versus right and wrong versus wrong situations, which we can talk about later if we have any time. Sense of duty, that idea of moral potency, moral courage, moral efficacy, a sense of moral ownership, physical courage, mental courage, psychological courage. Then having that leader mindset where you come in with a sense of developmental readiness, openness to learn, openness to change what you're doing, and to take indicators from the environment and respond to them in a way that you're always thinking about your leadership and how you can change and develop. The confidence of a leader, to have that infectious confidence, the self-complexity to be able to deal with VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations, make sense of all the chaos, and then formulate an adaptive leadership response. And then also some of you might have seen my papers on neuroscience applied to leadership, because we're really looking at a lot of both cognitive and affective leader brain activity that might facilitate more effective leadership. But a lot of my focus has been over on the left-hand side, the locus of leadership, where does it come from? But of course, also looking at how is it transmitted and what are some of the impacts. But again, up top, you got extreme context. All these variables that are down below, locus, transmission, and impact, all change and adapt and maybe morph and take on different forms when the context all of a sudden becomes more extreme. Character, for example, obviously you're going to need a much higher strength of character under these types of situations, or courage, for example. Some environments don't even call for courage or a sense of duty, but extreme contexts do, for example. All right, well, that was kind of a drive-by shooting. I know not a lot of time here. I probably even went over, but I'll kind of leave it at that. We can pick up in discussion here if we even have any time for that.